Spent the last 5 days until yesterday. It's been quite a ride.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here and
Well, my
sharing.
pleasure. It's good. It's
Oh,
good grist for the mill.
okay.
It's nothing like a trip to the hospital to keep resetting the wisdom center. So
Okay, I'm gonna
here
I'm
we are.
gonna start us I'm gonna start us live. Okay, hold on.
Beautiful.
Welcome, Warrior Sages. I want to introduce you to my friend Sam Morris, a strong ally, a Zen warrior, a man who's lived some very incredible life lessons that we'll be privy to today. And we met during this COVID time, and I was introduced to you. I heard great accolades from you from my good brother Adam Gilad, and he said that we must meet, and then we had the opportunity. And my first experience of you was very beautiful and profound, and I want to share with all the Warrior Sage family here that you're part of our Warrior Sage community here as well. You interact very nicely and beautifully. You share your wisdoms and you comment in very wise ways. So rather than me share much more about who you are, I just want you to know I'm very grateful for you to be here. Warrior Sages, I'm very grateful you're all listening in and dialing in. And there's much to learn today, not just from here, but here. And so I'm going to invite us all to listen with our whole body, our whole being, to our good friend here, Brother Sam Morris. So welcome, brother.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today with you, Satyen. I have so much admiration for you and everything that you're doing in the world. So it's such an honor to be here today.
Thank you, brother. So please share a little about who you are and what you're up to in the world with our Warrior Sages here today.
Well, who I am, I'm always working on figuring that out, and I don't ever get an answer to that question. No matter how much I ask that question, I don't think that there is an answer to that question, but I will give you sort of a brief autobiographical version that may capture some pieces that we put together the puzzle of how I have come to be who I am. It started in Maine, growing up on an organic blueberry farm. And from a very early age, I remember just feeling the sense of deep peace with myself and nature, and feeling the inseparable quality between myself and nature. And looking back, I could describe it now as sort of an inseparable connection with nature, but then it was just what was. That was just the experience. That's what life was at that time. And as I grew older, I saw the way in which my own ego or my own sense of self and the people around me would sort of start to identify with who they thought that they were, including myself, and sort of putting ourselves into identification boxes in order to fit in with our groups and fit in with our families. And we left behind that openness and freedom of our true nature, which is nature. And so I, like other people, started to accumulate thoughts about who I was based on my preferences and based on my interests and so forth. And around the time I was, 16 or 17 years old, it's the first time I used psychedelics, and suddenly all of that was shattered, and I was back to being nature. I was back to having the childlike wonderment that I had left behind for a short period of time as I went through, my early adolescence. And I began to realize that most people never leave behind. They never shatter that perception of self. They never shatter that identity. And so instead, they accumulating more and more thoughts about who they identify more and more with their thinking mind as being who they think that they are. And so I at that point, I began a path. I did not know that this was going to be considered a spiritual path at the time. It was just a path. I hardly even threw around the word spirituality at all at the time. It was just, this was what was the obvious direction for me, was to keep on obliterating any kind of sort of structured identity construct that would prevent me from experiencing myself as nature. And then fast forward to the summer of 1999, I led a bicycling trek for 9 teenagers across the US, because that was really what I was into at the time, was doing outdoor leadership stuff. Led a cycling trek, 3,800 miles. We camped every night. We cooked all our own food. And it was the biggest challenge that I had taken on at that point in my life. And shortly after finishing that trek, 2.5 months later, I was in a car accident caused by a drunk driver, and I became paralyzed from the waist down. And that really began the path that I'm on today. At that time, I was already so clearly able to understand the wisdom that I read about in Taoist texts and Buddhist texts, but never before had I realized I would be put to the test to the degree that I was. It's one thing when you're understanding concepts like non-attachment from the perspective of, non-attachment to a particular relationship, or non-attachment to a job, or non-attachment to a number in a bank account that you're identifying with. But it's a whole other thing when you're working with non-attachment, and that the attachment is with a whole half of your body. And so I had to begin the process of letting go of my attachment to my whole lower body from the waist down. And so that really, that was a little over 20 years ago. And the journey that I've been on since then has been working with healing arts, working with energy arts, working with breath, meditation, studying whatever I could, whether it was movement practices or breath practices or wisdom literature, which would help me to separate self from circumstances. And through that direct engagement, moment by moment by moment, day after day after day for 20 years, I had no option to come and go from it. I couldn't sort of pick up a book here or go to a yoga class there or whatever. I had to practice moment by moment by moment, letting go of my circumstances, because my circumstances were so extreme at times. The suffering could have ended my life on many occasions. So I practice moment by moment by moment to embody these principles and to continue to separate my essence from the circumstances of my life. And so now what I do with my clients through my work with my coaching program or mentoring program, however you want to see it, called Zen Warrior Training, is I teach my clients, many of whom are entrepreneurs, I teach them how to use these principles in their own lives to learn to see themselves as separate from their own circumstances so that they can have a clear perspective on their lives and their businesses.
Wow. Most of us in our life will never come across some level of intensity of this life lesson that you took on. Whether it is or not is our choice. Sometimes it's hard to even allow ourselves to feel that. Sometimes we're just crushed. Can you share with us, please, if you're open, after this tragic accident happened, how did you, what were you feeling, and what was the internal steps that kept you first lifting yourself out and then moving forward?
Yeah, I can. It's it's very complex in so many ways because trauma has so many different ways of sort of infiltrating the mind and body. And one of the things that I noticed was that I could show up with a strong attitude, with a resilient personality, because I had always oriented that way. It was very natural for me to show up as a resilient, strong person. And I could present myself that way. And deep inside, there was this wounded child that felt like it had actually gone back to a state of innocence and dependence that took years to actually surface. So a lot of my friends and family would see the part of me that appeared to be over the trauma, that and I convinced myself in many ways that I was over the trauma.
Yes.
But for years it would kind of lurk beneath the surface, and it would show up in ways that would undermine my ability to really live at my potential. It would show up with alcohol abuse, that type of thing. It would show up smoking too much cannabis. It would show up in a number of different ways. It would just be kind of there, just lurking, waiting to come up. And I got used to, the term spiritual bypass I'm very familiar with, and I've lived spiritual bypass a lot. That unwillingness to face that more vulnerable part of myself. I don't know if this necessarily answers your question, but I had convinced myself that I was over the trauma because I valued resiliency.
Yes.
And so I thought, okay, I've got this. I'm going to move on. I've got it. Whatever comes up, whatever I have to face, I'm going to deal with it. And I could be 99% there, but that 1% was still crying for help. And that 1% didn't know how to express the pain and the frustration. And that 1% would just kind of lurk there and under the surface.
Yes.
And you can't be that 99% and still be a healthy, whole functioning person. That 1% that still, even if you're 99% resilient, and there's that 1% that is still hurt, that 1% still needs to be addressed. And so those layers only came up years and years later when I was ready to face them. Some of them not until 10, 15, 16, 17 years later.
There's an old saying that 99% is a slow drip poison. It's a WarriorSage philosophy that if you're putting yourself in 99%, but there's some part of you that is withdrawn, some part of you that's rescinded or collapsed or pulled away or suppressed and not engaged fully in the process of presence, of being with all of it fully, bodily, everything, every nuance of every horrible feeling, every nuance of every flatness, from all that stuff, the heavier stuff, all the way up to our lighter shades of consciousness and our ecstatic states, in the whole spectrum. But 99% slow drip poison, but 100% pure freedom. And that one little, because I know you can see that in others.
Yes.
You can see when any performer is at 98, 99, and all it takes is that one dial in that just allows total freedom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that to the uninitiated, may seem that moments of pain and despair and darkness would indicate that one has somehow fallen off the spiritual path, or that there's something wrong with that experience, or there's that somehow a less enlightened state to be experiencing, when that's only through our limited ego mind that we would see that. In the mind of God, that's not true at all. In the mind of God, that suffering and that grief and that being incinerated in the existential fire is no less enlightenment than anything else. And so I had to learn that, had to learn to let go of thinking that it's only when I feel on, or when I feel a sense of joy or lightness inside of me, that I'm in that enlightened state. That the enlightened state can be being in a total state of misery. That can be, if surrender is occurring within the misery, then that is enlightenment. Yeah.
Brother, what are you seeing right now? We're in this very unique time on many levels of being. I'd love to hear what your experience of this is, and perhaps any guidance or wisdom you have lent to those that you serve regarding these times.
Yeah. Well, I see that we are in a state of, extreme flux and disruption right now. And I think it's only just begun. I don't think that this era is going to let up anytime soon. And I don't think that it needs to let up. I think that it's what we're experiencing, and I think you'd probably agree, is an absolutely necessary part of our evolutionary process as human beings, and with our relationship with one another and with our relationship with the earth. And I think there's going to be increasing divisiveness for a while. I started out this COVID period in a very optimistic state, and I still am optimistic, but I think I'm optimistic for the long term. There's going to be a lot of very intense challenges in the short term, I think. My feeling is that I think I'm kind of aligned with Dr. Zach Bush in this regard, that we may wake up just before it's too late. Just before, and I think that we are emerging out of so many centuries of conditioning that have had us perceive ourselves as separate from God, separate from spirit, separate from source, and that
separate from each other.
Separate from each other, exactly. And that in order to sort of compensate for that separateness, we have to somehow work our way back into good favor with God.
Yes.
And I think a lot of some of the most spiritual people, I think, are still following that sort of paradigm of needing to work your way back into good favor with God. But that's not necessary. We are already, we always will be, we always have been in good favor with God. And even that notion that we have to work our way back into good favor is it's part of separation. And so the way I see what's going on right now is, with all of this uncertainty, this is an opportunity for surrender. It's an opportunity to throw our hands up and say, I don't know. I do not know, and I cannot control my situation. I cannot control this outcome. when I became paralyzed, that's what I had to do over and over and over and over and over again. I had to let go of thinking that I was in control and that I could, through controlling my circumstances, somehow improve my condition or heal. I think that's another word that just kind of gets thrown around in a way that I think we can easily confuse ourselves by throwing around this notion of healing. And what is healing? Well, you can't heal that which is already whole. And I think more people are opening up to this, that we are already whole, that there's nothing to heal, there's nothing that needs to be changed. There's only more that needs to be surrendered to. And by surrendering to the intelligence that is already present in and around us at all times, I think that's the necessary step that is required for us to begin to move forward in a more holistically strategic manner, rather than trying to heal anything. But I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to that too. I think that ego holds on tight, and there's going to be a lot of people who are trying to control their circumstances and control each other. And so I'm optimistic for the long term, a little bit pessimistic for the short term. My optimism extends lifetimes.
Yes.
I'm not necessarily thinking that these things that I envision will necessarily happen while I'm in this physical body. I'm looking forward hundreds or more years.
Brother, what's in your heart to share? What's in your heart to share with those who are here, who are being called to step up, be of greater service, greater impact, somehow take a new seat in being, a new intention, or expand on theirs? What's in your heart to share to those friends out there like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I would say that what is in my heart to share is that whatever you may be going through right now, you probably don't have the context for how this is of service to the world. And I find that this is always true for me. I go through periods I have gone through periods of deep, deep challenges, deep, deep suffering, where the experience has seemed totally futile at the time and so painful, and where uncertainty was clouding my vision all along the way. And then only years later, look back, and suddenly the narrative that I was creating about my life and my circumstances was completely inaccurate. Because now, for example, looking back at the last 20 years, I can see things like being bedridden and immobilized in hospital beds. While that was futile suffering at the time, I look back and I see, wow, without having had that experience, I would not have cultivated the energy that I've cultivated today. And had I not cultivated the energy that I have cultivated today, I would not have nearly the type of impact that I've had on other people's lives that I have. And so now I see that suffering as an investment. Whereas at the time, when you're in the midst of the suffering, possibility of that, it almost always seems futile, because our minds want to say, you know, comfort good, suffering bad. We have this natural predisposition towards seeking comfort and trying to avoid suffering.
Yes.
But if you can know and embrace that the suffering that you may be experiencing now, or the uncertainty, or whatever it is an investment in something that is as yet unknown, that may not be known for years to come. But if you can experience it that way, then for me, my experience is I can separate who I am from the story. And then by doing so, then I can have my finger on the pulse of life that is occurring in the present moment. The life that is not conditioned by the false narrative. And my goal is always to have my finger on the pulse of life, not to be imprisoned by the false narrative of my mind.
You know, there's some of our friends right now in business, personal life, relationships, even death, are experiencing all types of losses, or fear of loss, even fear of destruction, fear of losing their business, their house, their sense of security and such. How have you addressed this, your sense of the trauma of loss? Perhaps how we can be served by that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm reminded of a class by Michael Singer, who's such a great teacher, the author of The Untethered Soul, and I very much resonate with this. He said something along the lines of, if you were to have your head separated by some visual shield from the rest of your body, and someone was to say this is a bit graphic for those who are about to listen to this, but bear with me, it's worth it. And somehow someone was able to anesthetize your foot so that you couldn't feel it. And they cut off your foot. Well, they asked you how you were doing. You would still say you were doing fine, because you wouldn't realize that the foot had been removed. And maybe they are able to anesthetize your leg, and they take off your entire leg, but you don't know that they've taken off that leg. They ask you how you're doing. Oh, I'm fine. I'm doing just fine. Thank you very much. I'm just sitting here behind this curtain. That's all that's happening. So in theory, now if they took that curtain away and suddenly you looked at what was supposed to be, and that what was supposed to be, that you were supposed to have a leg there and you're supposed to have a foot there, well, you would freak out. And suddenly you would go into shock, say, oh my God, what happened? Your whole system would go into shock. You might not recover from that trauma. But the only reason you were traumatized was because you had a relationship in your mind between what is supposed to be and what is happening in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I've had to do that in a literal manner for the last 21 years. I've had to learn how to separate what was was supposed to, that's how I grew up until I was 24 years old. I was a very able-bodied athlete. I was supposed to be an able-bodied athlete. And when
it paused for a second, can you repeat the last part again?
Yes, yes. With my personal story?
Just before that, just, yeah.
Okay, so if that person with their head behind the curtain, suddenly you remove the curtain and they looked down and they saw that their foot was no longer there and their leg was no longer there, they would freak out.
Yes.
They'd be traumatized.
Yes, absolutely.
And they might be traumatized for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Because what was supposed to be, that there's supposed to be a leg and a foot there, are no longer there. But when that curtain was still there, they thought they were just fine. They were doing just fine. It wasn't until their mind created the association between what was supposed to be there and what was now no longer present that the trauma occurred. And so I've had an actual real literal experience of this myself, where what was supposed to be was, at the age of 24, I was supposed to be a very able-bodied athlete, someone who could cycle across the US, someone who was an expert skier and snowboarder, someone who hiked every day. That was what was supposed to be. And suddenly, just like that, that was no longer the case. But the trauma, most of the psychological trauma, is from the relationship between what the mind perceives as what is supposed to be and what reality dictates is. So that's what I would say to anyone who is going through any experience of loss or uncertainty is, you're actually fine. Who you are is fine. It's not until you look at what was supposed to be and you see that it's no longer there that you think that you're not fine.
Mm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Brother, what's most important to you right now?
Well, what's most important for me personally is that my body experiences healing. I've had a number of challenges. I won't go into the medical challenges that make it very challenging for me to focus my efforts in other ways. So on a personal level, that's very important to me. On a broader level, what's important to me is that we actually start to let go of this notion of our separateness that has kept us imprisoned by our egos, and get that we are all in this together, and that every moment is an opportunity to function as a team, to function as a whole, and that this is no longer kumbaya talk. This is no longer hippie ideology. This is something that is an absolute necessity for moving forward. I think that for me personally, when I started to realize that nature had its own intelligence, i.e. the Tao, when I realized that I was far more vast and far more intelligent than I thought that I was. And And there's this naive sort of presupposition, and I find that this comes up a lot in the sort of personal development world, because it's all about sort of individual accomplishment. Sort of the be all you can be individualism that is especially predominant in Western culture. This sort of need to prove oneself, that it gets passed down. And I think it's creating a lot of depression and anxiety in our culture right now. And I think it's contributing to a lot of the problems that we see, this need to prove oneself. And my sense is, if we are able to embrace that there is an intelligence and a divine intelligence that exists inside of all of us, and that there is a way of nature that in Eastern philosophy, as you well know, is known as the Tao, that intelligence has its own way of moving through us, that it's not asking for us to prove anything to anyone, that all it's asking for is our cooperation. And by cooperating with it, we can let go of worries like, when's the next load of money coming from, or when's the right relationship, or when is this, when is that, because we'll realize that all is so full. Yes. In this present moment. All is always so full in this present moment, and that includes every aspect of ourselves, that the fullness of the present moment is already whole as it is. All it's asking for is our participation with it. And surrender is, in my experience, the most beautiful thing that we can do. And it is not, it is quite the opposite of giving up. It is letting go into a force that is much greater than our individual ego-based minds can possibly conceive.
Please speak to that. Speak to surrender.
Well, it's the thing that we, I think, are all challenged with every day. The notion that we are going somehow against the grain. I think that if anyone wakes up in the morning with struggle, then that is an indicator that there is an extra amount of effort that they have convinced themselves is required to start their day. Or if anyone feels like they are in a state of struggle, either with relationships or with their work, that struggle is an indicator of excessive effort being applied where it need not be applied.
Yes.
And surrender is a willingness to embrace the unknown, the unpredictable, a willingness to say, I don't know. I haven't been here before. And if I think that I've been here before, then what I'm doing is I am living out patterns of behavior that I have lived out in the past. And I'm continuing to carry my past perception of who I am, how to show up in the world. I'm continuing to take those past behaviors and try to struggle to create some sort of future outcome from my ideas of who I am and how to behave from the past. And that is self-defeating. That works great. It works great to have a map of because our brains work with maps so brilliantly. Like, for example, today I was navigating my way to a new location that I'm going to have to go to many times. And I was using the GPS on the first time. But I don't have to use it after the first time. I want to map this in my brain so that it becomes unconscious, so that I don't have to rely on my GPS from now on. And our brains can do that brilliantly. We can create these maps of orientation to orient ourselves in the world, to find our way from point A to point B, etc. But what we don't realize is that unconsciously, as soon as we create some type of behavior and achieve a certain result from it, we've now mapped that into our unconscious memory in our brain. And now that is the map of behavior that we use moving forward. Now that map may not apply to our present circumstances. And so our brains are trying to resource, how can I possibly use these maps that I've created? I know I've got the map here somewhere, flipping through, and that's where all this anxiety comes from, flipping through all of these files in our brain, trying to find the right map that we can apply to our present situation. But our present moment situation doesn't have a map written for it yet. And so surrender is letting go and saying, I don't have the map. I've never been here before. It's not in my unconscious memory how to handle this present situation. And since I don't have a map for this, I have to be open to learning. And I can only be open to learning if I surrender and let go and breathe and show up ready, willing, and able to learn some new information rather than rely on the maps from my past.
Oh, oh, beautiful. Like velvet directly into the heart of surrender, unfolding for all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. I think it's helpful to look at those analogies because, I think a topic like surrender can seem so sort of hard to grasp, or it can seem maybe ideological, but it's actually just logical. It's just logical. It's getting that our open present awareness is all we need to navigate the present moment, and that we don't have a map for now. Yeah. So I like the analogy because I think it translates into a language that the logical mind can understand.
Brother, as we come to a completion, please share with our friends how they can get in touch with you, and whatever else is there for you to share to complete with us all today.
Absolutely. Well, you can go to my website, which is zenwarriortraining.com. I'm on Instagram at Zen Warrior Training, Facebook.com/Zen Warrior Training. And I'd love to be in touch with anyone who reaches out, anyone who wants to continue the conversation. I'm happy to. And yeah, well, I don't know that we can do better than that last surrender bit in terms of a conclusion. That's just, I think what I'll leave everyone with is, my practice of surrender after going through what is perhaps one of the most challenging things for a human being to go through, which is paralysis. For the past 21 years, my practice of surrender has allowed me to see over and over and over and over and over again the value of letting go and letting spirit guide and dictate your life. And I see the evidence of how that keeps showing up day in and day out. And my life is so much more full because of my willingness to let go of the control of it and to surrender to something much greater. Oh.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much. Thank you, Warrior Sages. There's such richness here. The keys have been opened. You can feel this. Let's surrender to this highest knowing. All my love. All right, brother. Much love and gratitude.
Thank you, Satyen.